Part 2, on character, when pattern becomes personality. So we left off our discussion at memes. Memes are kind of like the building block of our conversation today. They are like the Lego pieces of everything that we're talking about. Memes are the building blocks of the cultural world. They are the building blocks of artworks, and they are the building blocks of selves, identities, personalities. It's the fact that all three of these things, art, self, and the world, can be seen to be composed of memes that is the key here. So let's pay a little attention to memes and try to understand what they are. Memes, conceived in Richard Dawkins' original sense, are units of cultural inheritance. Dawkins's background is in biological evolution, and he is famous for his writing about genes. And genes are, of course, units of biological inheritance. So a study of genes is a study of how traits in organisms evolve over time. But as he wrote his theories about genes, Richard Dawkins realized that culture evolves in much the same way as biology does. And so he came up with a kind of cultural analogue to the gene and called it a meme. And this idea appears in this book here, The Selfish Gene. There turn out to be many similarities in the behaviours of genes and memes. Where biological organisms reproduce their genetic information by leaving copies of it in their offspring, right? Leaving copies of their DNA in their babies. As cultural organisms, human beings reproduce ideas, stories, and norms through tradition. Both genes and memes are transmissible. They are copied from one organism to another. As they are transmitted, memes can evolve over time, just like genes can. And this is because memes get copied again and again, and each time they're copied, there is a chance that a variation will happen. This variation is called a mutation. If a mutation increases the likelihood that this meme is going to get copied again, then the meme starts to evolve in that direction. An interesting experiment that Dawkins did, which relates to this, was his experiment with these biomorphs. So bear with me on just a tiny little bit of biology recap here. You'll remember some of this from high school biology, but it's very relevant to how we think about culture and how culture evolves. So let's recap. In nature, changes in species over time are driven by natural selection. What that means is that if a creature has a gene or a characteristic that increases its chances of surviving long enough to reproduce and then pass that gene on, pass that characteristic on to its offspring, when that happens, it looks as if nature has selected that gene. And then, on the other hand, if a creature has a gene or a characteristic that is decreasing its chance of surviving long enough to copy itself, then that gene and that characteristic likely dies out along with the creature that carried it. So it looks as if nature deselected that gene or that characteristic. And that's why over time we see that species evolve in a certain direction. It looks as if nature is choosing what direction nature should evolve in. So certain organisms tend to discover eventually wings, like insects and birds, both independently arrived at the idea of wings because it helped them survive in their context. And this survival helped them also copy themselves. So anything that couldn't really copy itself, anything that wasn't likely to copy itself, kind of died out. The characteristics we're left with today in nature are the ones that were most likely to copy themselves, basically. So this is something that's going on in nature, natural selection. And then Dawkins had this idea to kind of copy nature's idea and write a computer program that would start off with some dots on a screen, and then those dots would copy themselves as if they were having children, so they would duplicate themselves, but there was a slight chance of a mistake in the copying, a slight chance of a mutation. And so that happened, the dots copied themselves with a little chance of some variation, and then Dawkins selected the shapes that he found most aesthetically pleasing, and then those shapes would copy themselves with a little bit of a chance of error, a little bit of a chance of mutation. And then Dawkins would again choose the shapes he found most aesthetically pleasing, and they would copy themselves, and so on and so on. So he repeated this process. And over time, what happened was the dots evolved into drawings tailored to Dawkins's aesthetic preferences. And he ended up with these insect-like looking things on the screen here. So Richard Dawkins called this process aesthetic selection. So rather than natural selection, it's now aesthetic selection. And Richard Dawkins himself is kind of playing nature's role here in selecting which traits go forward, which traits continue to evolve and which stop. And this was a while ago now, so this is 1986 that he's publishing about this in this book, The Blind Watchmaker. At the time, he was wondering, could artists use algorithms like these to evolve images as an alternative to directly drawing or painting them? And as it happens, my dad, Miloš Ranković, is actually such an artist. So he wrote a computer program in the early 2000s that generated digital art in this way. You can see some of the images on the screen he generated in this way. So all of these images are evolved over generations of parent and child images. And he wouldn't start with dots like Dawkins did, or like with random shapes, but he would start with found images, photographs. Two images would combine to create a child image, and so on. So an evolutionary process is not something that only happens in biology. It also happens in culture and in art. And that's because evolution is a general kind of creativity algorithm. Incremental changes in a certain direction towards a certain bias lead to big changes over time and the invention of new things. So a digital art project like this is making it visible to us, this iterative copying and variation and copying and variation that actually happens in all creative processes, whether that's nature, culture, or a single artist's practice. Let's see how this manifests in culture using the concept of a meme. So here, I'll show you an example of a meme right now on the camera. This is a meme, waving to say hello. So waving is a unit of cultural inheritance. It is a gesture which our caregivers transmit to us in early childhood when we learn to greet. And this single choreographic routine is repeated through tradition and reinforced in daily practice. Each time someone waves at someone else, the meme has been copied, transmitted, and reinforced in cultural memory. So other examples of memes could include other gestures. For example, I'll do another one on the camera, flicking your hair like this to convey sass. That is a meme. Political slogans like "Make America Great Again" is a meme. a moral belief or a piece of social etiquette, like the idea that you should not litter, that is also a meme. That is also something that gets a piece of cultural information that's shared and adopted by different people. A narrative formula, like "and they lived happily ever after," is a meme as well. My accent, the accent I'm speaking in right now, and all its little details of intonation are memes that I picked up from somewhere. Habits, like the idea that you'd have a cup of coffee in the morning, these are memes, endlessly reproduced in part by the hundreds of online morning routine videos that can be found out there. Posture, so the positions that I unconsciously assume when I'm sitting or standing or walking, these are memes, something which the artist Marianne Wex explored in her photographic study of gendered posture. Love, the feeling of love, the rituals surrounding love, the expectations of love, the conceptual framing of love, these are memes, and if you think about it, the mimetic nature of love is what makes it shareable, a communal set of experiences as well as an intimate one. All this to say that memes are neither inherently good or bad. They encompass the full spectrum of cultural invention. Maybe you can start to see how a self or a person or an identity could be made up of memes. And I won't go into too much detail about this today, but just so you know, the idea that a self could be composed of memes intersects with a family of philosophical thought that you may recognize at least a little, known as theories of subject formation. These ideas have to do with how subjectivity, being a subject, is actively formed through social practices and language. Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex, for example, explored how the idea of woman is constructed by social narratives. This exploration continues in Michel Foucault, for instance, where he outlines the discursive production of sexuality through history. Louis Althusser added to this emphasis on language in the production of identity by introducing the notion of interpellation, which comes from appellation, to call, appeler, the French word to call somebody. So it's a process by which individuals are hailed or called into subjectivity by the way they are named by apparatuses such as education, religion, and the family. And then, of course, many of you might recognize Judith Butler's theory of gender performativity, which builds on some of these previous concepts to examine the societal scripts through which identities are played out, and especially through which gender is played out and revised. So this could be a good area of research for some of you, but I'm going to stay with the idea of memes for now. Speaking of theories, ideas like the ones I'm trying to convey to you right now are also memes. In fact, teaching is a process by which the teacher essentially tries to infect students with memes. You might catch the idea, perhaps even pass it on to others. The meme then has a kind of life of its own, as it lives through us. I happen to have photographic evidence of myself becoming infected by a meme. Let's see. This was a film I watched when I was 8 years old, Disney's Mulan. I remember being so impressed by the protagonist that I went and I took the following photograph of myself soon after it ended. You can see that the meme, let's call it the sword held across face meme, seems to have jumped like a virus from a fictional character to an organic body. I'm copying the gesture. We can even see an example of what I mentioned earlier, a mutation. I've copied the orientation of the sword wrong. I'm sure I wasn't the only child to do this. I like to imagine all the times a child somewhere in the world decided to copy that gesture after watching the movie. All the little variations on the theme. It would be as if this single meme rippled outward into a lot of bodies. Maybe some of those children grow up to become writers or film directors, and then the gesture comes back, but in a different context and a different character. This is the life of a meme. You could imagine that in addition to the sword held across face meme, the fictional character Mulan is also made up of a host of other memes. She is a daughter, a warrior, a lover. She has a series of interconnected habits, beliefs, gestures, poses, language, formulas that together compose her character. We could say the same for my or your character. Therefore, let's define character, whether it belongs to a fictional person like Mulan or a real person like you, as a system of memes. So rather than being purely personal and essentially connected to any one human being, character is something that is caught and spread again through memetic contagion. Again, character has a kind of a life of its own. Using virus-related terminology such as contagion or host with reference to memes is common, as when we hear about an internet meme going viral or a video going viral. So that is already common, and it's not without reason actually. So there actually is a really strong resemblance between how biological viruses work and how cultural memes work. If you think about what a virus is, let's have a look at a picture of a biological virus there. A biological virus is really simple. It's pretty much just some genes encapsulated in a membrane with nothing else but its own possible repeatability and the assistance of host organisms to propagate it. And by the way, when I say a virus is simple, I don't mean in any absolute sense, but it's much simpler than any kind of life form. So for example, I don't know if you know this, but a virus is much more primitive and simple than a bacterium. A bacterium is a single cell organism and it can survive on its own. It's got everything it needs within that single cell to kind of move around and find food and process energy. It is like a tiny, tiny, tiny animal. But a virus is not. So if you have a virus on this table here, it's not going to survive more than a couple of hours. But a bacterium can survive. It can survive on its own. A virus depends on a host, on a body, in order to be able to live. And so if you're a virus, you literally depend on being coughed between other organisms, like from one human to another, in order to be able to survive. You have to latch on like a parasite onto something else in order to be able to live and pass on your genes. So all a virus is, it's this super lightweight thing. All it is this thing that can repeat itself. That's its almost most defining feature, its replicability. The main part of its body is its genetic material, its recipe for making more of itself. So what I'm trying to say is memes are also super dependent on their hosts. Memes also would not survive out in the wild without being attached to some kind of host. Like the waving I talked about earlier, a wave does not exist outside of its appearance in human bodies. In a lot of ways, there's a lot of resemblance in how biological viruses work and how memes work. Both are super lightweight. They're just these, almost just these ideas that get repeated. If we're thinking of character as a system of memes, so it's like a lot of interconnected memes that go together, then character too can be thought of as this kind of free-floating behavioural script that is contracted and then transmitted amongst human beings, intervening in their lives in the meantime. The philosopher Daniel Dennett goes as far as to offer a definition of the term person as, quote, a hominid with an infected brain, host to millions of cultural symbionts. Symbionts basically meaning memes here. So for Dennett, a person acts as a kind of vehicle for propagating these cultural memes through time and space. To illustrate this, he gives a really useful biological example. When we see a seed floating airborne away from a great old tree, like this little maple tree seed floating away from the big red maple tree, we tend to say that the tree is reproducing, with the tree as the active subject in that sentence. But a more accurate way to put it, perhaps, is that this entire scenario, the painstaking growth of the tree, its tireless photosynthesizing, and the architecture of the seed and its helicopter-like wings, all of these things actually act as an apparatus in the service of the little DNA molecule tucked away inside the seed. After all, if you think about it, genetic information is the only thing that survives. The biological apparatuses that temporarily house it then pass the baton on to the next generation and wither and die in the service of this great relay race of life. At the risk of continuing to provide a sorry portrayal of our human predicament as gene and meme receptacles, here is a similar assessment of our relative passivity in the task of becoming, this time from the sociologist Erving Goffman. He says, in analysing the self, then, we are drawn from its possessor, from the person who will profit or lose most by it, for he and his body merely provide the peg on which something of collaborative manufacture will be hung for a time. And the means for producing and maintaining selves do not reside inside the peg. In fact, these means are often bolted down in social establishments. So here, Goffman is referring to the kind of human being as this kind of peg upon which a self, a personality, a character is hung for a time. And it's not even this human being that creates this self, it's the society that is collectively manufacturing it for it. So here we are referred to as these pegs, these passive things that have character hung onto us, or personality or selfhood or subjectivity sort of pinned onto us. Now, important point is coming up, and I'm sure you're beginning to sense it as well. So, although referring to the human being as this machine for character, or a vehicle for memes, or a peg upon which communally generated attributes are hung, although this may appear to devalue human agency, perhaps a deeper understanding of how character lives and passes through the human can change the way in which we think about where the value of the human is located. It doesn't necessarily deny that value altogether. So my point of view, at least in all the things that I'm telling you so far, is what we've been talking about so far, memes having a life of their own and kind of flowing through us. I don't think that that is at odds with the idea that we have agency. So all I'm trying to do at this point by bringing these theories to you is to just emphasize the fact that human beings have a great capacity to be possessed by character. We're very, very absorbent. We're very flexible in a certain sense to be able to adapt to lots and lots of different ideas and to absorb different characteristics. So I just want to hold on to that idea. It's kind of interesting that human beings are, in a certain sense, so impressionable to cultural ideas. So let's hold on to this idea that the human being is super absorbent to memes, is super receptive to memes, and can become almost possessed by them to acquire a personality or a character. And I also want to highlight the capacity of character, the capacity of memes to be shared between human beings. So the fact that there's a certain fluidity about how we exchange characteristics and ideas. And I just want to bear that in mind. Also, just as a side point, I want to say that although referring to memes as viral or contagious may seem to attach a negative connotation to memes, they are neither inherently good or bad. And it's difficult to imagine what would be left of a human being if you took away all its memes. So this came up in a really great question in our seminar when we were together live. Are we talking about a certain kind of determinism here, that humans have no kind of choice in who they become? Because we're emphasizing the social construction of character and identity. And is there a certain kind of sense of determinism that we have no choice in who we're becoming? That the environment is sculpting us so thoroughly that there's kind of no escape from that. And on the one hand, yes, we can perceive ourselves as being incredibly intricately scripted creatures, scripted not only by our genetics, but also by our cultural mimetics. So we're scripted by our upbringing, and every little detail in who we were influenced by is kind of contributing a piece of our character. One of the ways in which I approach this question is, what would it mean to be indeterminate as a human being? So what would it mean if there was nothing that determined the way you were? If there was no real reason why you are who you are. Interestingly, if you kind of dig into the question of what it would mean to be indeterminate, to not be scripted by the environment and by history, you would kind of end up with a sort of random character, a kind of character that comes out of nowhere. So interestingly, one possible perspective is that being socially determined, in a sense, is what gives your humanity, your selfhood, your personality and your character meaning, weight. And we'll come back to this idea later, but it's the idea that, yes, there are all these memes living their own lives through you, but it's the fact that these have been shared and that these come from history that give everything you do historical weight. Every time you wave, you're connected to every other wave that has happened in the past. Every time you argue with your partner, you're kind of recapitulating or rehearsing or restaging every other argument between romantic partners in the past. So there's a sense in which you could take a pessimistic view and think, oh, I'm just this automaton, my movements don't mean anything, my choices don't mean anything because they're all determined. But in a sense, what would it mean to not be determined? It's actually potentially more of a meaningless scenario to not be a determined agent than to be a determined one. But this is a really big subject, and if you are interested in this determinism question, then one of the books I highly recommend that I already flicked through in this presentation is Daniel Dennett's Freedom Evolves. That is a really good starting text, and it's written in quite an accessible way. It has to do with a lot of the things we were talking about, such as memes. And it's trying to posit the theory that agency, like what we think of as free will, is something that potentially evolves. It's not just something that you have or you don't have. It's something that maybe evolves, just like wings evolved or, teeth evolved. Freedom is maybe also something that evolves. What is great about that book is it's a really good starting text to help you test your intuitions about, well, what do you actually mean by freedom and what do you actually mean by determinism? And do we need to maybe rethink what those words mean altogether? One of his greatest gifts really as a thinker is testing your intuitions about things, your everyday feeling about something. So what would your everyday intuition about freedom be? He's very good at getting you to train different kinds of intuitions. He's making the claim in that book that determinism need not necessarily be at odds with freedom, which is quite interesting. I'll leave that there, but that's another potential tangent for some of you. So we left off at this idea that human beings have these memes flowing through them, these cultural patterns flowing through them. We can neither say that memes are good or bad. They are everything, and that contains the good, the bad, and the ugly. The final sort of comment I wish to make about character as a system of memes, so our personalities, our ways of being, as a system of inherited cultural patterns. The last thing I want to say about that for today is that communication technologies have throughout history served to lubricate the transmission of character between human beings. I'll explain what I mean. So we live in a time of particularly rapid innovation in telecommunication, right? Communicating at long distances, as I'm doing right now when I'm recording this. And these new ways of communicating that have emerged in the past few decades, this is probably affecting the speed, the flexibility, and the migration patterns of character through space and time. So let's look at this little excerpt from Marina Warner's Phantasmagoria, a book about the kind of aesthetic history of spirits and ghosts and how it connects to metaphors like air, ether. She's interested in spiritual mediums and the popularity of spiritualism in the Victorian era and so on. So it's a really great book in its own right. But here she's talking about the connection between the transmission of human character and technology. Let's see what she says. The first mechanical communications technologies, such as Morse code and telegraphic signaling, disembodied persons in the world of the senses when they made it possible to broadcast human voices over the airwaves and record them for playing back on a gramophone. They could move an individual through time and space through the electromagnetic field, and the possibility has fundamentally shaped modes of storytelling, not only in literature and film stories, but in the way we tell our lives to ourselves. So, obviously, apart from telegraphs and so on in the era that Marina's talking about, more recent enablers of telecommunicating human character include, of course, video sharing platforms such as YouTube or Twitch, where a popular and already mature culture of vlogging enables people to broadcast a seemingly authentic screen-based character. Internet discussion forums like X or Reddit, where an analogous transmission can occur through writing, and virtual reality, where our cartoonish and photorealistic avatars alike will be able to meet in the metaverse and transmit patterns of human behavior there. Before the rise of telecommunication technologies, geographic separation meant a greater segregation of human character, just as it largely segregated biological species. But in the same way it's now common to see plants native to the Amazon rainforest in a Glaswegian tenement flat, geographic separation has rapidly become less of a barrier to the transmission of memes. Telecommunications are to human character kind of like what super spreader events such as indoor concerts are to viruses. They bridge gaps between infectable nodes, human beings, with greater rapidity and seamlessness. I'm often reminded of how globalization has influenced the faster, smoother, and wider transmission of memes and character when I talk to friends from my hometown of Leeds, where it is common, for example, to find a Pakistani-Irish rapper who speaks in a Yorkshire accent and uses a form of slang containing Jamaican, Urdu, and Nigerian words. And given that most of my own artistic education was largely derived from videos uploaded by various enthusiasts on YouTube of exhibition walkthroughs and artist talks, obscure old black and white films and out-of-production records, perhaps it is no coincidence that my artistic interest in character and memes did emerge. I was being constantly bombarded with character via the internet. When character becomes variable. So now we're transitioning into the second part of this second longer talk, which has to do with the character being variable. So just in the last slide, I was saying something there about my personal background that has led me towards an interest in memes, identity, and performance. And I will share something else about my background because it's an increasingly common experience, so many people can relate to this. Right, so I am Serbian. My parents came to the UK as immigrants. I was born in Yorkshire, so I spoke Serbian and English. And when I was 11 years old, I moved with my family to Norway. There I learned Norwegian, and I did all my high school and my college studies in Norwegian. So then I moved back to study art in London. I spent some time in Wales, and now I work in Scotland and Glasgow. So in my life, I spent a near equal amount of time thinking in these three languages and cultures, and personally have felt nearly equally connected to all of them. But that also meant I felt culturally relatively rootless, and I'm used to being understood as a kind of cultural outsider in most places I go. This is also true economically. I have a very odd economic background that kept changing throughout my life. At various times, we lived off my parents' student scholarships, off government benefits, low-income work, and then professional income work. So my life has been characterized by a continuously shifting and ambiguous class, economic, and cultural status. And what that means is my social network is wildly diverse. I've had to learn to fit into very different social groups, and in some ways, sometimes conflicting social groups. And in order to achieve that ability to be in these different places, I've almost had to invent a different version of myself for each social group, a different character, if you will, and that mostly happened unconsciously. Now, this is certainly not unique to me. It's a phenomenon that has been pointed out at least as far back as William James in this volume, The Principles of Psychology, in 1890, when he says, a person may practically be said to have as many different social selves as there are different groups of persons about whose opinion they care. Now, this idea of having different social selves for different parts of life, different contexts, different milieus, is also explored very, very beautifully in this autobiographical essay by the novelist Zadie Smith, Speaking in Tongues. In it, Smith traces the transformation that her voice underwent after leaving the working-class London neighbourhood of her childhood to study at Cambridge. Comparing the transition of her accent to the story of Eliza Doolittle in George Bernard Shaw's Pygmalion, about a Cockney flower woman whom a professor transforms from a working-class woman into a lady through these elocution lessons, the novelist Zadie Smith is reflecting on the voice of her youth, which unintentionally and incrementally over time was lost to this newly acquired posher voice at Cambridge. And she writes about how she wishes she could have retained both these voices rather than fully adopted either. And her essay ends with a provocation advocating the virtues of speaking in tongues and cultivating the use of multiple voices at one's disposal. While some people find their personal characteristics, such as accent, permanently change as a consequence of social mobility or migration, some people effectively end up collecting multiple characters and switching between them. This is normally the case in situations where they have to switch back and forth between different social groups on a regular basis. This was the sort of situation I found myself in my life. I was kind of switching between these characters on a regular basis. It's quite common, for instance, in bilingual countries like Morocco, where one language, French, is associated with official and public settings, and then another language, Arabic, is associated with the home or more intimate settings. Switching between language codes depending on the social environment is called code switching, and it's never purely linguistic. It's usually tied to some kind of social dynamic. So this is a program by Lucrece Grahua, and it's an excellent study of how Black professionals in London habitually switch their accent and mannerisms when they enter white majority spaces. It's a really interesting lesson. And similarly, code switching in the workplace is satirized to powerful effect in Boots Riley's dark comedy Sorry to Bother You, when the protagonist, an African-American telemarketer, suddenly strikes fame and fortune in the company when he discards his authentic voice and adopts instead an affluent white voice when speaking on the phone. Code switching highlights how language and memes and character more generally is connected to social power dynamics. This term, code switching, is now often spoken about in the context of marginalized individuals who have to adopt a kind of mask and alter their behaviors to be accepted into majority spaces. The need to adopt the mask can come with a feeling of pretense and inauthenticity, and the switching can lead to a sense of cognitive dissonance, or as the early African-American sociologist W.E.B. Du Bois called it, a double consciousness. While this is definitely going on, I think something else is also at play. And in my research, I found that I've been drawn to this more neutral term that comes from cultural psychology, frame switching. This is similar to code switching in that it describes someone who changes their behaviors or their character depending on the social or cultural context. And by frame, they mean cultural frame. And let's just say, for simplicity's sake, that it's a kind of frame of mind that's being switched. So I'm just going to bring up on the screen a little bibliography here for whoever wants to look anything up further, but this is certainly not in any way like mandatory reading or anything. What you're seeing on the screen is a list of scientific papers, and I'm bringing them up here because I think artists shouldn't feel like they can't read scientific papers. It will take a little bit of practice in the beginning to kind of understand the format, to understand how much of it you maybe need to read or don't need to read. But I don't think they should feel off limits to artists. I think they're really good because if you do happen to be interested in some other kind of discipline, it's nice that you're able to go straight to the source sometimes, before it's been kind of interpreted by journalism. And that's not to say that there's anything wrong with secondhand research at all, and it's hugely valuable. But I just want you to also feel like primary research, stuff that's being found out in labs, actual empirical data people are finding out in the field, for example, in this subject, psychology, all these things, they shouldn't feel off limits to you. So if you do feel like having a go at reading any of these, go for it, you know. But what I will do is say here that this is a list of scientific papers and I've studied them, and there are two things that I kind of want to extract from these and tell you about. Two things we can sort of learn from these papers. Firstly, it seems that people not only switch apparently superficial characteristics like accent or body language when they frame switch. There is evidence of deeper changes. Personality traits, cognitive functions like how well you remember something, opinions and beliefs can also shift depending on what cultural frame one is currently adopting. So, as an example, a very popular example in the literature, the same person can show signs of feeling more socialist and community orientated in one language, and then more liberal and individualistic when they switch to another. So the same person might profess different beliefs, even sometimes opposing beliefs, but they'll profess these beliefs more strongly when they're thinking and speaking in one language than in another. So it's almost as though an individual can have multiple personalities within them. And just to go back to the literature, you'll see some of the titles of these papers. I think there's one here, like 2 languages, 2 personalities. Even in the titles, you can see the suggestion of, oh, does multiple languages mean having multiple personalities, or multiple cultures mean having multiple personalities, which kind of goes back to what William James was saying when he said that we can say that there are almost as many, or exactly as many social selves one person has as the number of groups to which they basically belong. So that's the first thing that I extract for you from these papers, that it's almost as though individuals can have multiple personalities within them. And this time, unlike in the case of code switching, it's not like that they have this one true personality and then the others are just these social masks. It's as if they feel authentic in all of these multiple personalities. And it's just that the social context is bringing out different sides of their personal diversity. And the second thing that we can take from these papers that I at least find interesting, and it's pointed out by this paper in particular, is the finding that although a multicultural person might feel authentic in all these different characters that they're playing, from the outside they will be perceived as inauthentic if they are caught switching. So this actually happened to me when I was a teenager, and back then I had more of a need to switch between different contexts. Now I would say my social contexts are a bit more stable, so I don't frame switch as much. But I remember as a teenager, this was happening a lot. And back then I unconsciously switched my accent depending on the context. And at certain points I was accused of faking it. So this is reflected in the literature as well, that if an individual is seen to be behaving differently in different situations, then they will be perceived as less trustworthy, even less authentic. So it turns out that society favors a consistent presentation of self and is suspicious of fluidity, switching, change, and internal diversity. This is especially true of Western societies, but there is some evidence that it's the case in others too, though to a lesser extent. But in Western societies, there's a particular emphasis being placed on consistency, that a person behaves the same in different situations. So we have an interesting situation here, right, where sometimes people feel forced to play extra characters because of a majority intolerance towards minority characters. In the case of code switching, there's this need to kind of play these extra characters that you are actually not what you feel are part of you, but you're putting them on. But at the same time, we have situations where people feel a societal pressure to take their internal diversity and compress it into a singular, consistent presentation of self. And it just so happens that in this particular course, I'm paying special interest to this second point, although both points are interesting. Frame switching just happens to become particularly obvious in what we call multicultural or multilingual people, right? So those are the kinds of people who appear in these studies. When you read the studies, you'll read about people who are like mixed race, or maybe they are immigrants, so they have some kind of mixed cultural background, or they speak multiple languages, because frame switching maybe becomes particularly obvious in those people. But really, everyone is multicultural in the sense that everyone belongs to more than one social group. Already work and family, or like school and family, there's already two social groups. So it would then follow that everybody frame switches to some degree, and everyone has more than one character to some degree. Yet there seems to exist a social pressure to act as if we were singular. And the sociologist Erving Goffman examines this tendency in detail in this book, The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life. And he has a lovely phrase to describe this kind of singularizing of the self. He says, "A certain bureaucratization of the spirit is expected so that we can be relied upon to give a perfectly homogeneous performance at every appointed time." And honestly, if you can relax into his scientific language, he's just really objectively describing things, and yet it's such a riveting read actually once you get into the flow of it. He was a sociologist, and he was just incredibly good at observing things that are right in front of our faces all the time about how people interact with each other. And he would bring some things to light that surely you'll recognize. For example, how people in a household might change the way they act. When somebody knocks at the door, the mode of engagement suddenly changes. And he's making a lot of comparisons between theatrical performance and how we just act in everyday life, without saying that we're being inauthentic. He thinks that quite authentic social interactions, people just being themselves, can very accurately be described by performance metaphors and theatrical metaphors. And it's really, really an interesting and still, I think, quite fresh book in many ways. Obviously, it's quite dated, 1956. But he's written other books that I think have percolated into the popular imagination. For example, he's written on stigma, how stigmatized individuals live and how others relate to them in society. I think that sort of material is much more widely accepted today. But I think the contents of this book haven't actually really percolated into popular theory much yet. So a good one to look at if you're interested in the topics we're discussing today. But back to talking about multiple versus singular character and identity. Let's look at another excerpt, this time from the Italian author Luigi Pirandello, who also in general his work is very apt in this context. But this is an excerpt from his novel One, No One, and 100,000. And he's giving us a relatable example here of a situation where the effort to maintain a singular presentation of self can break down and can cause social awkwardness. I'm sure many of you will recognize it. It's a situation where you try to bring two of your friends from two different areas of your life into the same room. He writes, "It wasn't those two who were incompatible, those strangers one to the other, both very polite and perhaps made to get along splendidly. It was the two yous that you suddenly discovered in yourself. For your old friend, you have one reality and another for the new one. And in the intolerable embarrassment of thus finding yourself two men at the same time, you sought a trivial pretext to rid yourself not of one of the visitors, but of one of the two selves that the pair obliged you to be at the same time. So, through a few examples taken from biology, memetics, cultural psychology, and just everyday anecdotes, in this section I've tried to suggest how you needn't look too far to start thinking about selfhood, identity, and character in somewhat unconventional ways. In particular, I have been trying to highlight a certain ambiguity around the relationship between individuality and communality. When understood as a complex of memes, one's character, or characters, seem already always borrowed. Even intimate experiences, which, from an individual's point of view, feel so personal and specific, like a domestic argument with a partner, seem to echo domestic arguments from a larger cultural repertoire. We could multiply our every personal gesture, thought, and feeling into a vision of rippling memes across time and space. Rather than diminishing the value of the personal, the fact that our individuality is not unique is perhaps precisely what gives it even greater historical weight and meaning. It works a little bit like currency. If I just decide one day to invent a completely unique money token, like let's say I draw this piece of money on a piece of paper and I put my face on it and I declare this is now money that I want to use, it has no value, this thing that I created out of nowhere, because it's not plugged into the wider system of value exchange. It's not already plugged into that system of value exchange. It's only when we get our hands on a banknote that has already passed through many hands, that has already been part of the flow of exchange, that we hold something of value. So perhaps it is the same for memes, personal stories, and for character. So what we are talking about now is a distributed self. And this term, as far as I'm aware, comes from the anthropologist Marilyn Strathern, and it presents a view of the self that simultaneously locates it in the spontaneous, intimately embodied present and in the habits and formulas of an unfolding history composed of many bodies and other objects. It looks like, in anthropology at least, this idea of the distributed self appears to emerge from studies of gift economies and how external objects like gifts can act as indexes of personhood in some cultures. So in some cultures, when you travel to another island and you give the people there a gift and leave behind an object, it's actually understood that this object contains your personhood. And when you leave it there, you have actually left a piece of yourself behind. So these anthropologists were getting interested in how some cultures promote the view of the person as extending beyond the boundary of the skin. It can extend into objects and into ancestors and so on. So in this view, the self is distributed in the sense that it is located in objects outside of the body as well as of the body. But it is also distributed in the sense that one's most intimate, private experiences can be seen as but the latest iteration in an ongoing communal repertoire, and thus are not entirely one's own experiences alone. So, we'll end this lengthier section with a passage from Virginia Woolf's novel, Mrs. Dalloway, in which the protagonist is having a kind of reverie in which she imagines her selfhood to be distributed. She said, sitting on the bus going up Shaftesbury Avenue, she felt herself everywhere, not here, 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 as she tapped the back of the seat, but everywhere. She waved her hand going up Shaftesbury Avenue. She was all that. So that to know her or anyone, one must seek out the people who completed them, even the places. Odd affinities she had with people she had never spoken to, some woman in the street, some man behind a counter, even trees or barns. It ended in a transcendental theory which, with her horror of death, allowed her to believe or say that she believed, for all her skepticism, that since our apparitions, the part of us which appears, are so momentary compared with the other, the unseen part of us, which spreads wide, the unseen might survive, be recovered somehow attached to this person or that, or even haunting certain places after death. Perhaps. I won't unpack that paragraph for you too much, but obviously, as you know, Clarissa Dalloway, the protagonist of this story, is travelling on her bus. She's sort of picturing herself reflected or inflected in the others around her, the other people and other objects as well. And she feels like she has these strange affinities with all these strangers. When she adopts this distributed view of self, of herself, she even is able to experience a kind of intimacy, actually, with strangers, because she sees herself as this kind of convergence of shared, well, not in her terms, but shared memes, right? So there's some kind of spirit that is shared between her and them. I think it's also interesting towards the end there that she is thinking about how even her idea of death might change if she were to adopt this view of herself as distributed. Because indeed, when we talk about somebody passing or dying, the question arises, well, what have we actually lost? If the question of what a person is open, then so is the question of what actually dies when the person dies. So it seems to be serving some kind of solace for the protagonist here to be imagining herself as somehow kind of lingering, like her character or something about her spirit or personality or selfhood is kind of lingering like background radiation in the environment and the other people around her that she is connected to by these invisible strings. It is interesting to note, by the way, that this novel is called Mrs. Dalloway. That's the title of the book, so you'd expect to see a lot of Mrs. Dalloway. You'd expect it to be about her, but she almost makes about an equal appearance, I'd say, to a good other at least 5 to 8 characters. So your experience of reading the book is as if you're wandering in and out of the minds of a lot of different people who are connected by different strings. So there's definitely a wider theme in the book, I think, of interconnectedness and how even if you were to write a portrait of somebody under the banner of Mrs. Dalloway, to tell that portrait, you would need to go into other people. So that's quite an interesting thing about this book. But indeed, ideas about death or assumptions about what is lost at the point of death do change depending on what kind of view of the person you adopt. And this is true of quite a few other issues that are important to us. For example, crime and punishment. When we put somebody in prison, we are holding them responsible for something. So depending on our definition of a person, we might attribute blame and credit and responsibility differently, depending on where we believe the person starts and ends is also related to where we think responsibility starts and ends. So just to point out there that our ideas about what a person is, our beliefs around that affect a lot of other things. And I finally just want to end this section by giving a little bit of a nod to what I think is a religion, or at least a spiritual doctrine stemming from multiple areas in Africa, called Ubuntu. It's something I don't know that much about, but it's something I want to know more about. So just reading off Wikipedia here, Ubuntu, meaning humanity in some Bantu languages such as Zulu, describes a set of closely related Bantu African origin value systems that emphasize the interconnectedness of individuals with their surrounding societal and physical worlds. And Ubuntu is sometimes translated as I am because we are. And I think this has a very close relationship to this idea about the distributed self. So I'm just plugging that there. I don't know much more about Ubuntu than that, but it's going to be a line of research for me, and it may be for some of you too. But I would recommend taking a bit of a break there before starting on the next, shortest section.